My name is Chris Fernari. I'm the editor of brewbound.com. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I know there's still some people filtering in the back there, but there's 100 of you guys checked in right now. So first round of applause of the night goes to you guys for showing up. Thank you for coming out, everyone. For those of you that are just getting to know us, we come to town probably more than these folks over here would like us to, because I always put Tom and these guys to work. But we're Brewbound. We're an industry trade publication based in Boston. We come here a couple times a year to host events like this, as well as our full-day conference. So we'll be back in December. Hopefully we see some of you guys then. But the Brew Talks meetup is really just a good way to get everyone out, get a couple beers, and have some good conversations. Really with the idea being, you know, these are conversations that we're having at the bar, so why not stream it live across the internet and get some much more knowledgeable folks than myself up here to talk about things. So we got 2 talks on tap tonight. The first one is a topic that I think everybody is probably familiar with at this point, sort of been discussed ad nauseum, but we're going to give it one more go tonight, and that's defining craft. You know, right now is a pretty interesting time in the beer business. There's probably close to 4,000 breweries at this point in the country. I mean, the last number I saw was 3,500, so that was a few months ago. So we're probably, you know, approaching 4,000 at this point. And there's a lot of established breweries that are starting to think about their next steps. And oftentimes that means selling to an Anheuser-Busch or a Miller Coors, looking at private equity options, and that sort of changes how they're defined, not only in the eyes of the consumer, but in the eyes of trade organizations like the Brewers Association. So that's really sort of the focus of the talk. You know, kind of diving into how craft brewers should be defined, how craft beer should be defined, and going through some of the talking points that come around or come with this discussion. It's something that I know everybody talks about quite frequently at the bar. So let's kind of jump right in. You know, just wanted to start with a few definitions. You guys already know most of these. But and I got all my research here, but a big thank you goes to Stan Hieronymus from All About Beer magazine. I don't know if you guys follow Stan on Twitter or follow his work, but he's a longtime beer journalist, does a great job, and he actually pointed me in a direction of a story he wrote at the end of last year, and that's kind of what I'm referencing for some of these definitions. But everybody knows the BA definition: small, independent, traditional, 3%. Oh, you know what? I didn't even introduce our guests here. Sean DeWitt, co-founder of Coronado. Douglas Constantiner from Society, co-founder of Society. Tom Nickel, I think everybody probably knows Tom at this point. Nickel Beer Company, O'Brien's Pub, the man, the myth, the legend. Thank you guys for joining me. But yeah, everybody knows the BA definition: small, independent, traditional, less than 6 million barrels, less than 25% owned by a company with non-craft interest, and traditional. You know, they've kind of gone back and forth on these, but you know, using traditional ingredients. There's another group that calls themselves the Global Association of Craft Brewers, and they have a little different spin on it. At least 70% of a brewery's products must be distributed locally, so they really like the local tie-in to the definition. Independent for them is 51% of a brewery's products must be produced using a founder's own money, and breweries founded from a cooperation of multiple breweries and brewers may still be considered independent. And that'll be, you know, interesting to kind of discuss later for our next talk. But we're seeing, you know, some roll-ups and some cooperative consortium-type groups start to emerge now. And then creative. A brewery must show creativity throughout the brewing process. So a little vague, but, you know, certainly a different spin on the discussion. You know, Rate Beer has its own definition of what it considers to be a craft brewery. All of them really sort of zero in on this idea of independence and ownership. That's kind of the common thread. So let's kind of start there. For you guys, how important is ownership to the definition? Tom?
I mean, to me, I don't think it's a huge deal. To me, ownership is a question of what people want to do in the marketplace. If you want to support a particular company, a particular brand, if you want to drink Widmer, they make a great beer. They make one of my favorite milk stouts, Snowplow. I love it. I don't like it less just because they're owned by Budweiser. I wouldn't carry it less at my bar just because they're owned by Budweiser. But to me, that's a marketplace decision. I don't think that carving out certain brands just because they're owned by bigger companies is something we need to legislate when an educated marketplace can make that decision for themselves. And so that really wouldn't completely influence my buying decisions. That said, I don't carry a lot of Red Hook, Widmer, or Kona, but I also think that that's somewhat because of the beers they distribute in our area, not because of the beers they make. They're just looking to kind of carry to me some of their least interesting beers to a mass market down here in San Diego versus some of the things they're making up, at their breweries. So if they still carried Snowplow down here, I'd still sell it. But they stopped carrying it because they probably looked at some number sheet and thought, well, we're not going to sell enough of this to make it worth our while, so we're not going to do it. So in that sense, the big ownership is bad, but like I said, to me, that's more of a consumer decision than something I need to define as craft or not craft, especially since it's so particularly aimed at those CBA beers.
Right. Doug, how about for you? I mean, as a small brewer,
I really think it depends. We are, you can have a large brewery that's, or any brewery that's owned by a huge company that could be just as bad for the industry as a small brewery that's owned by someone who has zero interest in actually making good beer but just wants to make money. Starting a brewery with Travis, we were both brewers beforehand. I mean, we make all the decisions where you see other breweries, small new startups that might be hurting the marketplace just as much as a large multinational corporation could be hurting the marketplace by buying somebody out and kind of messing with the brand.
So when you say a small startup could be hurting the marketplace, that's more on the quality side, I would imagine, then?
Right. Just because Anheuser-Busch just bought Elysian doesn't mean that some other Wall Street guys aren't starting a brewery to try and make money in Connecticut or New York or Greenwich, wherever they live.
Right.
It goes both ways, and I think ownership is important, but it depends on where you are, who the guys are, and you kind of evaluate the place just by the quality of the product, and not the ownership.
Doug, a lot of there's multiple owners here at Coronado. I'll get you.
All right. Love these mics.
In terms of ownership, I mean, how big of a deal is that to you guys? You got to go out there every day and compete against some of the more well-resourced brands. And when a craft brewery does sell, they have advantages that you don't. So that's been one of the arguments that's tossed out before for the ownership piece. So how big of an issue is ownership for you when you're defining craft?
Well, for us, we have not thought that was a very big issue at all. The fact that Elysian got bought out by AB, and the fact that one day they were Elysian, and the next day they weren't. I mean, the beer in the tank didn't change. They're still craft beer as far as we're concerned. So, no, for us it hasn't changed, but I can tell you, I mean, we're distributed by a lot of people who are AB distributors. So it's challenging for us how to answer that question, right? I mean, we want to be good by our distributors, but why is it making that noise?
Getting a little bit of feedback back there.
Yeah,
well,
so.
And that is a good point. I mean, if they're going to get share of mind from the wholesaler, that kind of puts you guys in a tough position as a truly independent company.
Right.
Is that kind of where the argument lies? Is the focus from the wholesaler, the focus from the retailer?
The way I see it is that the folks that are making craft beer like Elysian and 10 Barrel and those folks just because they got bought out by somebody doesn't change the way they thought or the beer that they have in the tanks. I mean, they're still making good beer.
Right.
Still making craft beer as far as I'm concerned. Now, I know that's not a part of the definition, as is. But at the end of the day, yeah, they're going to have more advantages than we are, for sure, in distribution and all that good stuff.
Right. Yeah.
I want to add something in, but yeah, places can be owned by huge corporations, but if decisions are made based on making more money and not what's best for the beer, I think that's when it kind of starts to cross the line.
So the product should always be
Absolutely.
the primary.
I think we all got into this because of the product.
So we have a very interesting case about this just in San Diego, where Alpine, I'm going to preface this, I love Alpine, I love Green Flash. I think the beer made at Green Flash tastes just the same. So I don't care, I don't have a dog in this fight. But I will say as a retailer, the perception of Alpine being bought or partnering, however they're terming it, with Green Flash, people come in and they ask, is that made at Green Flash or was that made at Alpine? And here's a clear craft brewery, partnering, acquiring with another craft brewery. There's no multinational corporation involved, and yet people are still concerned about where the beer is made. And that's not everybody's defining moment, but there is a section of the public for whom they would rather drink the Alpine beer made at Alpine than Alpine beer made at Green Flash. And that doesn't involve an evil multinational corporation or Budweiser or Diageo or InBev or any of them.
That's a really small niche, though.
Well, it is, but I'm just saying, that is interesting that people react that way, even when it's craft on craft. Right. You're making craft beer at one craft brewery, and for me, the ultimate litmus test on this question is, will people drink Pliny the Elder if Budweiser bought Russian River? Then you'll know exactly how much people care about big companies buying breweries. Because if Pliny the Elder were available as much as you wanted in all 50 states, but it was made by Budweiser, would you buy it? And that will be the ultimate litmus test on this question. And until that happens, we'll never have a definitive answer on how much this matters.
Well, try telling Vinny that, I guess. So I think, I kind of want to take a step back and, kind of go back in history and think about how the definition has evolved, and then sort of turn the floor to you guys to, conjecture a little bit about how it might continue to evolve as the category continues to evolve and mature. So back in 1984 was the first time, and again, this is from Stan's piece, but back in 1984 was the first time that he found that craft was used in actual print. And at that time, the industry was about 72,000 barrels. So what they decided was craft beer in '84 was, what Coronado might make this year. And now, obviously, everything has grown and exploded. It's about 20 million barrels in 2014. So you would assume that the definition needs to evolve alongside that, and it has. And it's changed from 2 million to 6 million, and you can't use adjuncts to, you can use adjuncts as long as it's part of a traditional process that you were using for a number of years, whatever it is. And all these little pieces have kind of come and added on. But at the end of the day, my question is, how much will it continue to evolve? Can you keep bumping up the cap? Can you keep, can you go past 6 million? How do you define the ingredient usage? Does ownership ever change? Is it, zero, as breweries get acquired, do they reassess the 25% ownership even? So how do you guys think the definition will evolve, knowing how far it's come from 1984?
Wow. I see no problem with it evolving. I think it should evolve. It should be something that's adaptable. I think if something cannot be adaptable, then the name craft, BA didn't do a good job. I think they did a great job. Now that everybody else is, getting into craft and the whole, every industry out there that you use your hands, there's more coffee shops out there now, and that whole kind of segment, that some people say is hipster, we should evolve with it, not the hipsters, but when, Vince Gattoni said craft, maybe it was just a chance. When we, BA wanted to call the industry or our members craft beer, and was it 2005?
What's that?
That when they defined craft.
Yep.
Again, chance they were trying to do the right thing. I don't think too much weight should be put on the actual word craft.
Right.
And I think it's all about the product.
Tom?
I think to me it's ultimately, you're trying to legislate what is quality. And I think it's a very difficult thing to do, but to me, busting through barriers, I mean, if we don't want to raise the 6 million barrel mark, none of us should be in this room. We should, craft should go to 6 to 8 to 10. I mean, that part of it should be endless. And the ownership, that's an evolving thing. You've got the Brewers Association coming at it from an angle of we're trying to represent our membership, but the consumer doesn't particularly care about who is or isn't a member of the Brewers Association. And so, I think that there will be an evolving consumer definition alongside an evolving industry definition that will, hopefully eventually end up in the same spot.
But in that sense, the industry definition, when you're looking at barrelage, I mean, it does matter because these businesses are fundamentally different. When you look at a business like Boston Beer and a business like Coronado and then, a business like Society, all three are completely different from one another. So how do you represent the interests of all three at the same time with a single definition?
That's what I say. I think it's got to be constantly evolving. And to me, the cap doesn't matter as much in part of the definition as it does, what you're, like I said, what you're legislating is quality. You want good beer, whether it's got adjuncts or not, whether it's, traditional, creative, you're inventing a new style.
I want to jump in.
Go for it.
Jump in on the cap, just to hear it from you. Do you think we need a big bad guy to get people to come to our side?
Well, the craft brewing industry has been built on an us versus them mentality, and the definition is carved out to continue the us versus them mentality, the David versus Goliath that we have thrived on and survived on, and frankly, in my mind, outgrown.
And if
we shouldn't be talking about David versus Goliath anymore. Like, we've kind of won that battle, and they're reacting to what we do, not vice versa.
We're here.
Right.
We're not going anywhere.
Interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
So, you brought up the term craft. Like, we shouldn't be talking about the term craft, but that seems to be the one sticking point that everybody wants to protect. Like, it's ours. It's a craft brewery. It's a craft beer, and we have to protect this. Otherwise, Miller Coors is going to call Blue Moon its own craft beer, and then everything that we've worked so hard to build is gone. Does craft need to be protected, and if so, from who or what?
I think craft has gotten a little broad, right? I mean, back in 1984 when craft was first used, it was very simple to understand who was making craft beer and who wasn't, right? Now, 2015, I think those lines have gotten blurred a little bit, right? There's a lot more people making craft beer, according to definition. And the big boys are now trying to make so-called craft beer. So I think the lines have gotten blurred a little bit. And I can tell you, when I first started brewing beer in 1995, I thought making craft beer was defined as anything where you used a paddle, right? In 1995 and 96, I know there was a bunch of brewers in here. I think most of us were making beer like that back then. Maybe Carl Strauss might have been the only one in 1995 or 96 that wasn't using maybe an oar or a paddle to make craft beer. So I thought anything other than that was considered cheating, right? You're just pushing buttons. You're not really making beer. Right. You're just pushing buttons. I'm making beer. I'm mashing in. I'm sweating. I'm doing this by hand. But
like a true craftsman would.
Yes. However, now none of us are craft brewers, I think.
Now is when's the last time you used a paddle?
Long time ago. Long time ago, yeah. I haven't brewed beer in 8 years.
Well, then that ties directly to size then, obviously.
Yeah. So.
Well, and I think you bring up sort of an interesting point, and I don't know that this has quite found its way into craft brewing or the craft beer space, but I've seen a couple instances of it, at least in the spirit side of things, where I think it was Tito's. They had on their labels handcrafted or handmade, and there was a class action lawsuit against Tito's because the product wasn't actually handmade. And I wonder, what the implications are for craft and craft beer when you're essentially telling consumers by marketing your product that, this is a craft thing, we're making this by hand. Now, it's not as explicit as saying handmade, but I mean, that sort of speaks to what you guys are saying with, turning the paddle and using instruments to actually make the product versus pushing a button.
I don't care if you're using the paddle or you're pushing buttons, but you're actively doing something, and everybody in this industry takes a pay cut to leave a job that they were doing something else to be doing this. You're not joining something to make money. Anybody who starts a craft brewery gets into manufacturing. Manufacturing is based off of volume, right? If you were to start an energy drink tomorrow, you don't start your own facility. You go and you contract it out.
Co-pack.
We consciously make the decision to start a terrible, terrible business in terms of giving profit to owners or shareholders because we want the product.
Right.
So I don't care if you've got a lot of automation or not, you're in this because you want the product. If you're, pressing buttons or something, there's someone above you who's controlling it. And it's, I don't know, the whole thing of robots, fuck them. I mean, there is human touch in this beer.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
But so what you're trying to say is you're basing a definition then off the passion of the people that are making it.
Yes.
And so I mean, there's no way to define that. Like, well, the beer has to be made passionately. You can't put that in a definition. There's no way to legislate a definition of passion, and realistically, there's no way to legislate a definition of quality. But ultimately, that's what we're talking about up here. Is that the people who care about this have passion and make a quality product. And that ultimately is craft beer, but what they're looking at is like, well, how do you categorize that?
Right.
How do you put that into a box that includes all three of us and Sierra Nevada and Sam Adams?
Do you want to work at the companies that we're at? Would you leave your job for less money to do what we're doing?
I'm not interested in less money.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good question and a good starting point for trying to understand, who the people are behind the brands, if they're willing to jump off the cliff. But, we cover the non-alcoholic space on the BevNet side as well, and there are plenty of entrepreneurs there that are willing to take the leap and jump off the cliff just because they're going through a co-packer to make their energy drink. They're still probably just as passionate about the business side of things.
What's their end goal?
Well, they have financial goals, but are you going to tell me that you don't want to make a good, you don't want to send your kids to private school, you don't want to have a good, drive a nicer car, from brewing?
It's just like getting a buzz from drinking. It's a nice side effect, but that's not the goal of drinking beer. I think I used to do investment banking in New York City. I strongly believe that people who start those companies have an end goal, they have a business plan, they say in 25 years, I'm gonna grow this business to have this much revenue, this much profit, I'm gonna sell it for, $50 million, boom, I succeeded. Not, I made the best passion fruit tasting 5-hour energy shot there was out there.
Right. But why can't you do both in craft brewing? I mean, why can't you just be a passionate business owner that happens to also want to be incredibly successful and sell your company at some point in the future? Why do those two have to be separate? I've never understood that.
I'm sensing a society keg price cut here.
We keg only so we don't have to bottle and potentially deteriorate the quality of our product.
And will that
so we have high keg prices.
But will that always be the case?
As of now, yeah.
So you're gonna grow draft only for as long as you can.
We'll bottle the sours, a couple Belgians, one stout. I want to decrease that, the difference between the keg pricing and the bottle pricing. Sorry, Tom. Not saying you should charge a lot for beer, but I don't think you should get into beer for money. Beer is always the worst thing that could happen to this industry is if we turn into wine. The snobbery of it, the class level of it, Pliny the Elder, right? The best beer in the world, how much you charge? $5.25?
$5.50? No, $6 now. I think
okay, it's gone up. I remember paying $5 for it. Anybody, I don't care what job you have, you can afford to buy the best beer in the world for $5. Show me cheese, food, wine that you can do that with. Spirits, you can't. So I think this is not meant to be something where you get into it to make money and kind of like compete on, oh, what beer are we gonna make that let's really squeeze the margin out of this beer.
So it seems like for you, the money side of things is directly tied to quality in many ways.
No, it shouldn't be tied to quality. Yes, you want to lower your costs of everything. Let's get better prices on our hops, on grain. Where can we cut costs? But you shouldn't be making decisions based off of making more money. I think it should not be. You should not use a grain that you don't like because it costs less.
So as a question here then, do you think the ownership percentage or the ownership question and the definition of craft is important? Because obviously that 25% ownership stake that they're talking about is purely money motivated.
And that's why I'll say it depends, because you could have a brewery that's doing 1,000 barrels a year, that's one owner, and all he wants to do is cash out on this or try and grow. So he's going to make those decisions. Or you have huge breweries that...
there's poorly owned independent breweries.
Correct.
But, I mean, is that 25% ownership stake from a multinational corporation important to you in defining what is not craft? Because to me, it seems like the BA is more interested in defining what is not craft than what is craft. And what they're doing is they're carving out a segment of the industry. So, I mean, is that ownership stake important? Is Elysian any less of a craft brewery today than they were 6 months ago?
No, not yet at least.
Not yet, okay.
You said poorly run companies. That has nothing to do with what I was saying, which is running it for the wrong reasons.
Well, right, poorly owned for the wrong reasons.
You can be very profitable at 1,000 barrels a year.
Owned for the wrong reasons company.
So what about the role of private equity then? I mean, because they're the ones that have somehow, they found a loophole, or the Brewers Association just hasn't addressed them yet. But the question that's always got me is, how does a company like Sweetwater sell a minority interest? We don't know if it's 25% or what it is. It hasn't been disclosed, but how do they sell a minority interest to a company like TSG, which also just co-bought Pabst, which is not craft by the Brewers Association definition, right? So ownership in a non-craft brewer. How do they sell a piece of their company to TSG and still remain craft, whereas Elysian or Goose Island or any of these brands immediately excommunicated? And Goose Island has proven that they can make quality beers for 3 or 4 years without any undue influence from AB, right? So I don't get how these are being judged.
So I think it's wrong to excommunicate breweries. No, I think it's wrong to judge the breweries that are bought out. The guys at Goose are great, and even you look at you talk to some of these beer guys, the beer nerds, and they're like, oh no, why I bought Goose Bourbon, Goose Island Bourbon County Stout from this year because that's when they're still craft. I'm like but you're still giving these guys your money today. So what's the difference? I think the big difference is when you're owned by a public company, their interest is as shareholders. Private equity, that's not necessarily the case. They want to pay themselves.
Yeah. So I mean, isn't that sort of worse at the end of the day?
There's not as much pressure on the CEO.
I think there'd be a lot of pressure.
Not as much.
I mean, you would know better than I. You came from that world, right?
Doesn't mean I know a lot about it. I was a minion. But I think no one should be judged too soon. I mean, with the Elysian thing, 10 barrel, everyone's kind of up in arms. If the beer's still good, fine. But if you go out and you have XYZ brewery that was doing really well and it was purchased by a huge public company, it doesn't even have to be a brewery. It could be Diageo, and the beer goes to shit, then there's a problem. But until it goes to shit, but then how do you measure the
So
pile?
yeah.
That's the whole question. How do you define that?
So of the three tenants, and we'll start with you, Sean, because you've been quiet over here. So
Well, I like listening to these guys.
yeah.
Makes it easy for me.
So of the three, small, independent, traditional, I mean, let's just replace that for quality, right? Because you guys have been hitting on quality. It's got to be a good product. Which one is most important? Like, is there a pecking order? Like, how do you rank them?
Well, wow, I mean, traditional, if that includes quality, as far as we're concerned, that's most important. No doubt about it. I can say when we moved into this facility and we moved from our 10-barrel system, which seems so small now, just to a 30-barrel system, but with 120-barrel tanks, we had a lot of experimenting going on. And I can tell you, the beers weren't exactly the same as what we were used to. They weren't bad, but they weren't what we were used to. And going forward, as we grow, I mean, we could do technically 30,000 to 40,000 barrels this year, and that's a lot for us. I mean, last year we did 24,000. So for us, we're very conscious of that. Brooksy, I like to call him Brooksy, Ryan Brooks, our head brewer, very conscious of that aspect, and the fact that also now we have a lab that analyzes all our stuff. That's huge. I mean, that's all we heard from anybody who was a little bit bigger than us, is that you have to have a lab to make that so. So for us, did that just turn off? Oh yeah. So for us, yes, I would say traditional quality ingredients. The beer that I'm drinking right now has a lot of unique ingredients in it. But I did start off with a sock knocker.
So if a company that would jeopardize your status as a craft brewer came in and said, we're going to improve the quality of your beer, but you lose the ownership piece, how do you weigh those two?
Well, I can guarantee you, I know we wouldn't do that. No, we've had this conversation internally. What if someone came in and said, we'll offer you this much, what would we do? And for the most part, we said we would just stay as is. I mean, we're doing okay. We don't need to have somebody come in and buy us. And so we would not go with that fact. Not at all. Not even close. Now, it would take a lot of money. Like, I'm not even going to speculate. It would take a lot of money for us to sell out. And I'm not saying anybody who has sold out, that's bad. I'm just saying it would take a lot of money for us to sell out.
So let's turn the conversation then to the consumer side of things, because at the end of the day, I think that's most important. The consumer is ultimately going to end up deciding what is and isn't craft. They're the ones making the purchasing decisions. They're the ones drinking the product at the end of the day. So in many respects, they should be the ones driving this discussion. They should be the ones voicing their opinions and saying, this is what we want to be craft, this is what we consider craft. So I guess, where does the consumer fit in this conversation, in this debate, and how much should, I guess, their view of the beer landscape be considered when we're trying to define this product that, everybody sort of has a different opinion about?
I mean, I think a lot of this has to do with retailers in terms of what they advertise as craft. What gets sold as craft, not just by the big breweries, but by everyday retailers, by the liquor stores, by the chain stores, by the grocery stores, and what they put under the craft umbrella helps the consumer define what is craft. And certainly Shock Top is sold as a craft beer. It's in with the other craft beer. It's not right next to Budweiser and Bud Light, but would we define that as a craft beer? Would we define Blue Moon as a craft beer? But the consumer does because of where they're placed in the store and where they're placed within the ad. So I think, large retailers, large chain stores, until you change their attitude on both defining it and marketing it, the consumer is going to accept what's being sold to them through the advertising industry. I think that, and I mean not everybody, but I mean there's a huge chunk of people who are just going to accept whatever is being sold as craft beer, or we're having a craft beer special, all of the beers that they're including, they're going to be like, oh yeah, that's a craft beer, whether we think of it as or not. And whether the retailer is defining it in any way. It's just how they're advertising it.
Well, and you sent me that photo
the flyer,
before.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like, I don't know, it said like Corona or Dos Equis
Corona,
was craft.
Victoria, Negro Modelo, Dos Equis, all under the craft beer banner. Guinness, which I mean, You know, I mean, by any definition of craft beer, Guinness isn't. But I mean, how many people think of Guinness as a craft beer? You know?
But don't you think that most of the people drinking beer these days are a little more understanding of what craft beer is?
Well, absolutely. That's what I say. It takes an educated marketplace to make decisions, or their consumer decisions about what they're willing to accept as craft. But, you know, I mean, Guinness, case in point, I mean, it is an import, but it's owned by a huge company. But, I mean, do people think any less of Guinness in terms of quality or flavor just because it's owned by a huge company? And I don't think the average consumer does.
So I want to get back to the term. I mean, I feel like as an entire segment, as an entire category, anybody that's, you know, you used it earlier, you know it when you see it sort of thing. A lot of these craft brewers, whether they're defined by BA or not, have certainly benefited from the brand of craft. And you're seeing craft show up in other places outside of beer. You know, I don't know if beer was the primary catalyst for that. It seemed to be the driver towards that. But you're seeing craft coffees, craft sodas.
Distilling?
Yeah, craft distilling. I've seen, sausage companies do it, and, this is our craft line of sausages. It's like, okay, yeah, your Hillshire Farms, you know, I think brewers have certainly benefited from the brand of craft. And at what point do you think craft just sort of becomes a non-issue and we're just calling it beer? I think it was Greg Cook had a tweet towards the end of last year. It was something like, when do we drop craft and we start calling good beer beer and we start calling everything else crap or something like that? It raises a good question. I mean, it seems like
the definition of non-craft beer.
Well, it seems like craft is a crutch right now.
Yeah.
When do you lose the crutch and start walking?
There's a non-craft beer definition, and then there's just beer. And maybe they should be working on how to define what isn't craft beer as hard as they're working to define what is.
Right. I don't think it's a crutch, and I don't think it's something we should lose. You just said that we might have possibly, you're pretty sure that we are the ones that were kind of the catalyst for craft. We called it craft, and everyone kind of jumped onto us. We didn't benefit from that any more than if we had called it real beer, but I think we couldn't have done that because real ale, if we had done it in 2005 and said, let's just call this XYZ beer, I think it still would have done just as well now. I think everybody else has been playing off craft brew for, obviously a good reason. We've succeeded because so many people have gotten into beer. More people kind of took that leap and started breweries and made good beer. I don't know, maybe you're right. It's what is not XYZ beer, and what are we? I think craft right now works really well, but people are going to abuse it. If we change the name, they're going to abuse it. So,
could you sell as much beer if you weren't marketing it as craft beer, or do you even market it as craft beer? How much do you rely on craft as a term?
We don't even sell our double IPA as double IPA. We sell it as big IPA. So we're pretty...
Would you say you predominantly market yourself as a local brewery?
Yes.
As a hook versus a craft brewery as a hook?
Yeah, it's 100%. We do, and that's our business model though. As of now, there are no plans to grow big and distribute in a bunch of states. There's nothing wrong with that. But we say we're the local, San Diego brewery. We don't want our stuff getting too far outside of here. You want to drink society, come here. And I was going to touch on that when you asked Sean about what's the most important, size, independent, or ownership. I think size has nothing to do with it. Look at Sierra Nevada. Probably in the industry, the most respected brewery in the industry, 4 out of 5 people. They're huge. They're tiny, Stone, Dogfish Head, Bell's, breweries that I drink on a regular basis are gigantic compared to me. And not only that, I'm gigantic at 3,000 barrels a year compared to a nano brewery. Yeah, but you're not. I mean, you know what I mean? It's
Sure. Well, but what happens? I guess on the legislative side, if it gets to the point where some of these businesses that you just mentioned are going to benefit from a carve out or a law change, or you might benefit from something happening legislatively and they won't, and God forbid, they oppose whatever the movement is to, maybe it's a growler situation. I mean, anything you could think of down the road that might benefit somebody, much smaller than a Bell's or much smaller than a Stone, but it wouldn't benefit them. They might oppose it because they see it as a competitive threat. And then it gets back.
I really don't think they would.
I mean, right now in Massachusetts, we have the carve out for franchise laws. I know Boston Beer and Harpoon have really been pushing it, and they're pushing for a 20% carve out. So if you're less than 20% of the business, you would be able to leave. In New York, it's 3%, right? So why are the breweries like Boston Beer and Harpoon pushing for such a high number? It would truly benefit 98% of the breweries, even if it was less than 5% of a carve-out. If it was a smaller figure, it would benefit more people. It would benefit more business owners. So the question comes to mind, well, why are they pushing for such a high number? So I wonder how much of that, at some point, you could see a larger craft brewery opposing what some smaller craft breweries doing, and then I think that's when we really start to define things. And I don't know. I think legislatively, there's a lot that goes around the craft brewing definition. So I don't know. Have you guys thought about that? Have you guys thought about what happens when it gets to that point, or if it gets to that point?
Well, personally, I feel like at the end of the day, like I mentioned earlier, I believe the craft beer consumer now is a lot wiser than they were 20 years ago because they didn't know what they were drinking. So I feel at the end of the day, the craft beer consumer is going to tell us what they know and what they don't, right? So they're going to know that Shock Top and Blue Moon is not a true craft beer, right? I feel that the consumer is a lot wiser than maybe we give them credit for, and they're going to let us know what they consider craft. That's our thought. I mean, that's what we think.
So the consumer will ultimately decide, and I was trying to think of a good parallel before I came, and the one that came to mind for me was, like you hear craft brewers discussed as artists a lot, or artisans, and in the art world, if you go mainstream, if you start producing things for profit, if you start making your prints for profit in a large quantity, or you have people that are making your prints for you, right, and you're profiting from that, the true artists see that as, oh, well, he's not really an artist anymore. And I wonder, how that fits in the context of craft beer, Oh, you're just making a lot of barrels, or you're doing this for the money, or you're doing it for other reasons that don't make you a true craft brewer for the reasons you got into it. The person taking photographs in the art world got into it because they loved photography, and now, maybe they are doing something a little different than when they got in, and that's just how businesses evolve.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, you look at a company like Sierra Nevada and how big they are and how many new beers they introduce, and I mean, you think about Stone, and I mean, they could just make Stone IPA, Ruination, Arrogant Bastard all day long, but they come out and create a beer like Go-To IPA, which is an awesome beer, and the companies are still innovating, they're still creating. So, again, like Doug said, it's not about size, it's about, how much creativity, passion, and interest do you have in what you're doing? And as long as that drive is there, I mean, if Sierra Nevada just made, Sierra Pale, Porter, Stout, and Celebration, they wouldn't be where they are now, they wouldn't be as respected as they are now.
And touching on that, and you talk about, there are the people who want to do these small creative experiments. I am a huge fan of the holy grail of beer. It's not something that's hard to get, and you get to drink it every once in a while. It touches on what I was saying earlier about the wine. The holy grail of beer is Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. It's something you want to drink every single day and doesn't get old. So, I've been wanting to do a beer festival called the Rare Beer Festival, because there are no other festivals like this. You bring your, Orange Wit, or whatever it is. You bring your biggest seller, Carl Strauss brings Red Trolley. But it's look at this beer that we've made more of than anything else, and this is what got us here. So I don't care if you make more of it to make more money, as long as it's good, and it is good, and this is what got us here. So, and that, coming from a brewery that doesn't want to grow, all I want is a beer that everybody can drink every single day.
I like
so.
Sean, we're running out of time here for this panel, so we got to get to the next one. This is your house, so we're going to give you the final tweet of the night, the final 140 characters to send us out.
In my life.
This is going to be your first live human tweet right here.
Really, who's tweeting it out? You guys?
You're tweeting it right now.
I've never tweeted in my life, so I love it. Honestly, I'm 45. I'm old, maybe.
Define craft for Coronado in 140 characters or less.
I can honestly say 20 years ago, I never envisioned sitting with a panel like this in front of cameras and people with a brewery that has tanks the size that I see ever. I never would have thought that. In 1995, when I started learning to brew beer, it was a 10-barrel system, 10-barrel tanks. We were just a local brew pub in Coronado. I never would have thought I would travel to Sweden and Japan and many places in between and drink our beer in those locations. And I can't believe what's happening in the beer business. I love the fact that San Diego is what it is. Almost 100 breweries. I feel like everyone's doing a great job. It's truly amazing. I don't know what else to say except I feel like I made the right career choice.
Well, I think so. Cheers to you
Wow.
guys. Thank you.
Nice. Did I get you?
I can see through this one. Is it still craft?
What's that one? Is that mine? Oh, you're too kind. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys for joining the panel discussion. It'll be interesting to see how this topic develops over the next few years. Maybe we have a different definition for craft at some point in the future. Who knows what it's based on? Is it local? Is it ownership? I'm going to be curious to just sort of cover it and watch it.
One thing I want to touch again on that I'm very passionate about that we didn't talk enough about, it's not about rarity. It's not about how hard it is to get, or membership, or club, or price. We all got into beer because it's easily acceptable, and we can't push people out of it. And this industry will be destroyed if we become snobs. So you got to remember that.
I like that.
I agree. I think everybody probably also needs a refill. Before we do, I promised Tom.
I just have one quick announcement for all the brewers in the room. We have moved up the deadline date for the San Diego International Beer Competition. It is Friday, March 27th. You can enter online at the San Diego Beer Festival.com website. So again, San Diego International Beer Festival and competition deadline, Friday, March 27th. And that's it.
All right. We're going to take a brief break for you guys to fill up your beers, and we'll come back here in about 10, 15 minutes. Thank you. Round of applause for these guys.